Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Braitch, and this is the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I am an emotional health and leadership coach and co-founder of the not-for-profit Seen and Heard, which supports those seeking healing, connection, and systemic change. My vision is to move myself and the world around me towards connection and compassion. And each week, I will connect with amazing guests who are on their journey to bring about meaningful change in their own lives and the world around them. Thanks for being here. Let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. Today I have the great honour of being joined by Colin Campbell. Colin explores cross-cultural synthesis of Western depth psychology, mythology and traditional South African cosmology. Born in Zimbabwe in 1963 and raised in rural Botswana, he travelled extensively across Africa with his archaeologist father, apprenticing with indigenous knowledge keepers at sacred sites. After graduating with distinction in fine arts from the University of Cape Town in 1987, Colin studied psychology and African musicology. In 2000, he and his brother Niall were initiated as Sangomas into the Fondo lineage. They founded the Ngonyama lineage and School for Traditional Healers in Botswana, training approximately 60 students and offering wilderness-based programs to politicians, environmentalists, and indigenous leaders worldwide. Colin facilitates transformational group processes globally, from the Amazon to London, Ethiopia to Los Angeles. As a long-term Gaia Foundation consultant, he develops experiential African cosmology trainings. In 2022, he co-founded Animate Earth. His work bridges traditional African wisdom and contemporary thought, inspiring reconnection with ancestral knowledge and the natural world. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's really lovely to connect. And just before we started recording, you were helping me a little bit with pronunciations of some of the language and I'm not sure I got it all right, but I will do my best throughout this podcast, and I'd love it if you could set me straight when I've got it wrong. So it's important to hear
very
things.
well.
It's important to hear things as they're supposed to sound rather than me butchering it. So. Yeah, but it's lovely to connect. I found my way to you and your work via some wonderful therapists over here who do work with internal family systems. They work with people who've been through the boarding school system, institutional upbringings, difficult childhood experiences. And they said, if you're interested in kind of the bigger picture stuff, connecting with traditions and our roots, must speak to Colin Campbell. So here we are. Exciting. I always like to start the podcast by kind of going back to the beginning and finding out a little bit about how things were for you when you were growing up. So yeah, please do share as much or as little as you'd like around your kind of early years journey.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So as you said in the intro, I was born in Zimbabwe, but actually at the time, my parents were living in a very small sand settlement in the western Kalahari region of Botswana, a place called Khansi. So I think literally a few days after I was born, I was picked up by my father. My mother and I were picked up by my father in a Land Rover and driven across the western Kalahari to Khansi, where I began my life. At that time, Botswana was predominantly wilderness. It had a very, very small population, and Khansi was literally out in the heart of wilderness, a sort of semi-arid region. And from there, we moved around Botswana through the course of my childhood to different places, as my dad did work, first of all with the wildlife department there, and then, but all the time also, practicing as an anthropologist, archaeologist, and cultural historian, and doing research and working. And his work predominantly took him to sacred places, I would say, to sacred sites, to sites which are very important in Botswana, and more particularly at that time, I suppose. Initially, I would stay at home with my mother when he went off, and he was away a lot. And then in about 1967, we settled in the south of Botswana, near the capital, Gaborone. And at that time, my family was involved in a car accident in which my brother and sister of the time were killed. And I was thrown into the crisis of things by that as a 6-year-old child. And of course, my question to my parents endlessly and continuously and unhalteringly was, where have they gone? And obviously they weren't in any good place to be able to kind of respond to that. And so I didn't get answers. However, at some point, my father said to me, listen, we can't really answer this, but perhaps we can find somebody who can. And from that point onwards, I began traveling with my father into the wilderness wherever he went. And wherever we got to the sites where he was working and to the communities with whom he was working, and this was all over Botswana, he would point out, an old woman or an old man or a group of people, and he'd say, I think you should go and ask your question to those people. And I'd wander over and I'd ask my question, and I'd get a very similar answer. We can't tell you, but maybe we can take you somewhere where you can find out for yourself, or you can be told by those who know. And I wasn't sure who they meant by those who know at the time. But later I learned that they were referring to ancestors, to spirits, to keepers of these traditional wilderness sites. And so I began a process of being taken to these places and spoken to, and frustratingly, my question remained unanswered. I'd sit in caves or sit at rock sites or be told to do this or that or the other. And while I learned an enormous amount in that, the question remained essentially a conundrum or a koan at the heart of my being. And I mean, a lot happened. I mean, it was a time in wilderness, and Botswana was at that time, predominantly wilderness, and the traditions who lived in that wilderness had very deep relationships, and it was combinations of hunter-gatherers and more settled ancestral people that we kind of interacted with, and it was a remarkable growing up process in absolutely every way. In a world which today has pretty much, I would say, disappeared. There are little fragments of it left. I mean, globalization hit the Southern African continent in the early 80s, particularly in Botswana. It had come into South Africa and other countries earlier than that. But in Botswana, I would say, it really took hold in the late 70s and the early 80s. And the world that I had grown up in, at least as I saw it, kind of just began to dissolve in front of me. And then I left Botswana actually when I was 21 to come down to Cape Town in South Africa to study to study fine art at the Michaelis School of Fine Art here at UCT, University of Cape Town. And I suppose in a way I left everything. I came down here into a city, and I began as a student a city life, and nobody knew who I'd been. I didn't bring that with me, essentially. And so all of that stayed there, and I became, in a way, somebody else in another place. And to cut a very long story short, I went through university, and then I went through postgraduate work, and then I went into advertising as an illustrator. All this time, kind of cursorily attending to the life that I'd created in my growing up period, going back to Botswana and spending some time there, but not particularly potently, I would say. And then disaster struck in the midst of having just set up an advertising agency of my own. I got really, really ill, and I was unable to continue, and I had to go back to Botswana, and I went back to see some of the elders whom I'd been working with, and they said, well, what did you expect? You you gave yourself to being, and you know yourself to belong to the ancestors, and you abandoned all that, and of course you're going to get sick. So here you are back again, and now you're going to have to be repaired. And it was at that time that I went and entered into a lineage of the Sangoma tradition. So I'd been part of a lot of other traditional frameworks before that, but the Sangoma tradition was really the component that essentially I went into to deal with the sickness that I now had, which in traditional terms is understood to be the sickness of called relatively the sickness of ancestors, directly translated. And there's a way in which ancestral spirits within me and my life have to be brought into some kind of constant symbiotic relationship in that time. And thereafter, I returned to Cape Town, but then had a relationship with a much more integrated relationship again with Botswana. And Neil, my brother, at the same time actually had a series of his own problems. He was working in Northwest Canada at the time, and with an NGO over there, and he was working with traditional people over there, and he also started encountering serious problems, came back. And so the two of us went to deal with this ancestral sickness together through the initiation process as Sangomas. Thereafter, and we hadn't necessarily anticipated this, but we were told during the course of our training that we were to become initiators ourselves. And so when we came out of that training, people started coming to us, as they do when you have a particular calling to be a trainer, with that same ancestral sickness. And so we began training students under the tutelage of our trainers, and very soon we had a school. And that was what we did for the remainder of the next 15 or so years. And then as the environment and the cultural frameworks that relate to it in Botswana really started to take what I would conceive to be significant strain from globalization, we ended up having to close the school. And we weren't sure what we were going to do, and we kind of made our lives quite more centrally here in Cape Town. And then at some point, very clear messages started coming back to us in various ways, mostly from the natural world and from our ancestors and so on, that we needed to go back and readdress this issue of our school. And so we went back, and things began to open up again, and we've started training again in a very different way, and working with people in a very different way. We've reopened our center there, and people come and visit us, both locally and from all over the world. And we've opened our work with the sacred sites there and with the communities. And there's a growing interest where there'd been a complete decline in interest among traditional communities there in their own traditions, and a desire much more for the modern world and industry and all that promises. There's been a kind of I'm not quite sure what to call it, but a despondency with those promises not being fulfilled. And people are coming back and saying, oh, actually, we'd forgotten, and we need to go back, and we need to rethink, and we need to bring back these parts of ourselves. So a lot of our work at this time is a combination of that, and then working with these traditions all over the world, essentially. And that's pretty much what we're doing at the moment. And that's really the story, in as potted a form as I can give it.
Colin, you did a beautiful job of such a rich life, and then trying to sort of condense it down. It's not easy, but thank you so much for sharing about your family as well, about your siblings. My heart is with you and with them, and with Dad being away, quite a lot when you were younger, before you started traveling with him, and then losing your siblings from this life. I feel great sadness for that. How did that shape you? Do you feel those, you talked about the sort of ancestral sickness that came later. Do you is in sort of Western language, of trauma, etc., do you correlate, or is it slightly other different things?
Well, I think, the way I see it is that there are, I'm going to use the word shamanism for a moment, just because we kind of have a vague sense of what that word means. But I say vague because it's a very genericized word now. It means anything and everything, just about. But let's put it this way. I think that in our world now, there's a bit of a cleave. There's the world of our Western, our current, who we've become, essentially, modernity, let's call it. And then there remains a world of our pre-industrial nature, which is still there, but obviously given very little space in the world that we occupy now. And so when we ask a question like that, in a sense, there are going to be two answers to it. There's the answer that is going to be part of our modern everyday persona, and there's a different answer that is going to be given in the pre-industrial nature part of ourselves, which, by the way, is the much older part of ourselves and the much bigger and longer part. I mean, for the predominance of our human history, that's who we were. So this is a very new part, this modern aspect of ourselves. And I think it's very useful within that context to look at these issues in terms of, trauma, be that perinatal, developmental, and finding our remedial interactions with it. It's very helpful, obviously, to do that, and to even understand quite a lot of our existential angsts and within that framework. However, there is this other part of us, and in a way, in order to enter that part of ourselves, we've got to decouple ourselves from the trauma model. And we've got to start looking at the things that are going on in us, the things that are happening in us in a slightly different way. And we've got to take what I would conceive to be a kind of a psychospiritual slant to it. And in that sense, a lot of what we would kind of label potentially as trauma or pathology or complex or any of these sorts of things become something else. They become part of a bigger coalescive process that is taking the individual into a very particular relationship, both with themselves, with their commune, and more particularly with the greater other than human world, so to speak, in all its different dimensions. And so at that, in making that transition, again, it's important to, I think, in a sense, re-language things. So I could say, well, from a psychodynamic point of view, yes, I experienced a tremendous trauma at 6 years old, and responded to it pretty much as you imagine a 6-year-old would respond to it. Closure and all kinds of responses to that, and yet, if you take it over into the other side, of course, what it planted at the heart of me was an existential question that has been the quest of my life. It's the thing that sent me out into the wilderness, that returned me to a voracious desire to existentially get to the bottom of what this thing called existence is, and what happened there, and what happens to me when I get there. All these sort of questions. So, and in this area, in this area of things, in this aspect of ourselves, I think, we're no longer really recognizing, psychopathology, if you call it that, or complex or anything as limitation, so much as it becomes the building blocks of something. It's and in fact, it's not just valuable; it's vital. And so we're very cautious about saying, well, something needs to be either ameliorated or reduced or transcended or reversed or changed or healed or any of that sort of thing. We would say that the healing is, in fact, the incorporation of all these parts of ourselves. All of that is who we are. And all of that is critical to this other part of ourselves. And then as we do that, and as I've done that, the question becomes, and how do we now bring this into our modernity? What is the integration process? And it's a bit of a conundrum, but I think we're called at this time to really work with that, to really say, how do we bring that much older, much bigger part of ourselves into this much younger, much newer, rather confused part of ourselves that is now exploring modernity? And I think that's always part of an initiatory process. The initiatory process is always about how do we take the history of who we are into what is becoming, what will be next, which may be very fundamentally different.
Colin, thank you so much. Yeah, it's unpacking that. It's really helpful. I agree with the language. I mean, my way into this kind of work that we're talking about today was through the kind of psychotherapeutic door, of
Yes,
trauma and complex
yes,
and adverse childhood experiences, and
yes,
and it was so helpful for me because I live in England. It's a Western, it's one of the main sort of colonialist cultures, if you like, that march around the world and stuck a flag in things and you gave
right,
everyone a church and etc. So I grew up in the boarding school system here, which is the heart of that colonial power structure. So I've had to come in the traditional way, and then it's been a great remembering, if you like,
mm, yeah,
of kind of who we are, where we came from along the way, and my God, the stuff that's had to fall away. It comes off in sheets, like shedding a skin every now and again. I can feel it. Something's gone. A part of buying into modernity, taker culture, civilization, whatever you want to call it. But I'd love to explore that a bit more, the kind of our journey. But to stay
yes.
with your story a little bit, when you found yourself sick, and you returned to get healing, what did you experience during that process of sort of, in language that people listening can get a hold of? How were
Yes.
you feeling when you were sick, and what sort of process did you undertake, and how did you start to feel as the process took hold?
So, how did I feel? I think the first thing I can say is, I've always had, understandably, I guess, given my history, a sense of existential overwhelm. It's always been a very core part of who I am, and I can't remember a time when that wasn't present, in various forms. I have dreams and I have visions and I have experiences which, are to do with infinity and vastness and aloneness and utter aloneness and annihilation and all these kind of existential things. And that's always been with me. But at this point where this sickness set in, that just expanded into a crisis level. And I was completely crushed by a sense of existential overwhelm in the most radical form. And it expressed through me physiologically as well. So I would find myself shaking through the night and feverish, with sweat. And I would find myself in the kind of terror that I had never to that point imagined possible. Um, uh, Horrendous dreams of being devoured by wild animals, particularly lions, other creatures, interactions with snakes, all terrifying, uh, and an all-abiding sense of utter and complete doom, as though there was just no hope for anything anywhere, and an underlying depression, which is difficult to put into words. I mean, the kind of depression that is absolutely soul-consuming. And I literally felt like my soul and spirit were being hollowed out of me, and that I was turning into a translucent husk with nothing in it. Um, and this was accompanied by physiological maladies. I had an extreme rise in interocular pressure. I had heart palpitations where my heart would literally lose its rhythm completely and just kind of randomly do its thing. And a whole host of other very frightening symptoms. And initially, I did go and see medical doctors and people like that, and no one, I mean, could really. It didn't feel like anyone could really understand quite what was going on, and no one seemed to be able to point me in a direction that would say, other than medication, here's a way you can work with this. And what is true is that at that time I hadn't met the kind of people that I have now in the Western world who, are in the Jungian world and so on. It wasn't really available to me then. And so in desperation, I went back to Botswana and I went back to the people that I'd grown up with and presented myself and was divined and told, you ran away, you've now got this sickness, and not only that, you've got a possessing spirit. So possessing spirit. So how does that work? That's its own long story. But the defining principle of a Sangoma of the Abangoni tradition essentially is that there's an entanglement between my own spirit and what we might refer to as an alien spirit. And I don't mean alien from outer space in that, but alien to me, somebody else, entangled with me. And the entanglement is inadvertent on both sides. It's just one of those happenstances that happens when circumstances are configured in a certain way. And the result of that is this kind of sickness that emerges, this complete debilitation. And when I went to see traditional people, they said, "Oh no, this is Sangoma sickness. We can see it from a mile off. All the symptoms you've got are typical." And so, I was sent off to see a Sangoma. My brother and I went to see him, and he said, "Absolutely, I can confirm you've got a possessing spirit, and you're the only solution. You've got two options. You're either going to die, or you have to go into lineage, which is the particular kind of training, kutwasa, where essentially what they would say to you is, or what they said to us is, you can't exorcise the spirit from you. You take the spirit out of you, you're going to die. If you leave the spirit in you and you don't do anything about it, you're going to die. So you're going to have to go and figure out how to live with the spirit, and that's what the Sangoma training is all about. So Sangoma training is, in that sense, a mediumistic training. It trains me to live with the spirit in a manner which is generative both to me and to the spirit. And so that's what we did. For several months after that, my brother and I were in a traditional community, going once again through a traditional initiation, this time to become Sangomas. And that solved the problem. The illness disappeared within weeks of going into training. And the training was extremely tough. I mean, it was really, really hard. Partly because, what they do is if you imagine the sickness that I was suffering from as a kind of a vast storm of which I'd been sort of battling the edges of, it's as though somebody points to the heart of the storm and says, "Listen, turn your tiller right to that heart, and that's where we're going." And that's what we did. And it was a monumental business. But the result was I come out with a symbiotic relationship with my possessing spirits. Actually, spirits, there are three of them. And that is formative to the way I now live. So it's a very central part of who I am.
Colin, thank you so much for sharing that. I feel a lot of emotion coming up as you're talking through. That just connecting with my own journey in my parlance, breakdown 5 years ago, completely debilitated. Existential crisis. I've ceased to exist in my framework. I lost my body. I was sort of a floating, fearful head, impending doom. A dark night of the soul found my kind of guiding light, if you like. My coach Piers Cross, who's a Buddhist monk. He's done a lot of indigenous training, shamanic work. So he's got a very broad scope. We went into, and when you said to point to the eye of the storm, in the work that I do with clients day to day, my saying is always the only way out is through. You can't run, you can't duck and dive. It's set the controls for the heart of the sun. I'm with you. Just buckle up. You're going to face parts of yourself, and whether it's the language of spirits, which I connect with, but I also connect with the language of the parts of yourselves that you've put into shadow, some more sort of psychotherapeutic language, if you like, the parts that have been wounded and annexed. But for me, when you're hurt, when you're hurt at a soul level, there is a hole. In that hole, things can get into that. And whatever your language with that could be spiritual, or it could be possessing, or it could be along the lines of you become entangled with coping strategies or addictions or survival mechanisms, whatever it is. There is the work is to understand firstly what's happened, what's within, what are you feeling, and then to start to unleash the grip on some of these things that have come in, understand them, integrate, etc. But your journey sounds really powerful. I'd love to check in with something which is become central in my life, which is the idea of soul loss and power loss as being the sort of, for me, the defining sort of human malady or illness, if you like. So power loss being, in my parlance, I'd love to hear your take on this, the connection with the earth, with with the other than human people. Our distance from it is our source of power, if you like. So if we're too far away from it, so when I went to live in
Yes,
London, I got incredibly sick. The
exactly.
concrete, the people, the lifestyle was toxic. I am not supposed to be there. I'm supposed to be of the sea and of the forest. So the
Yes,
further I get from the sea and the forest, the sicker I get.
yes,
And then soul loss, in my world, the parts of ourselves that either we weren't born into this life with, that were lost generationally, or that were lost in trauma, or whatever we like to call it, the recovery of those parts, or the integration of living with the things that are within us. I'd love to hear your take on where the sickness lives, your language around it, and any of those points I just raised.
yeah. I mean, I think you're saying it very beautifully there, and I mean, I think soul loss is really a thing of the time in a way. I mean, I think as a cultural collective, as a Western cultural industrialized collective, which is of course increasing to encompass the entire planet at this point, this idea of soul loss, I think, is at the heart of that to some extent. I think we all experience it in one way or another, and we remediate it with all that we do. The accumulation of material stuff and competitiveness and all the other stuff, trying to kind of rebuild what feels like a dwindling component within ourselves and within our collective. Misguidedly believing, I think, in a lot of what we think is going to rebuild it at this point in time. But I think the way I maybe like to give my position on it is really to offer an image, which is a simple one. If you imagine going into a forest and you see a plant growing in the forest, and you think, oh, that's a really beautiful plant, and you dig it up and you put it in a little pot and you put it in your car and you drive back home into the city or however far away, and you put it on your terrace, it's very unlikely actually that the plant is going to thrive and grow there. And the reason for that is because the plant has evolved to live in the environment in which I found it. And so what begins to happen is it begins to wilt, it begins to wither, it begins to deform, it begins to lose its integrity as a plant. And I think the same is true of us humans. We're designed, in my opinion, we're designed to live in wilderness. The vast majority of who we've evolved to be has happened in that context. And suddenly we've peripherized all that. And we've said, okay, no, let's uproot ourselves from all that, plant ourselves in the modern industrialized condition, if you like, which in a way is symbolically as far away as possible from wilderness as we can get, and all that goes with wilderness. And we're paying the price of that. We're paying the price of that biophysically, we're paying the price of it psychologically, and we're paying the price of it psychospiritually. And we're trying to adapt within this environment to compensate for all that. So our healing modalities and all that we try to do. But unfortunately, it doesn't address the root problem. It treats the symptoms to an extent. And so I mean, soul loss is, when I spoke earlier about these two parts of ourselves, we have to transit back into our earlier pre-industrial selves to really even have a conversation about the notion of soul loss. So what does soul loss mean? It means an abandoning of the spirit, or of the spirit of ourselves, or parts of our spirit are lost. They either dissolve or disappear, or they are taken from it. There are various ways that soul loss can happen, but it's essentially systemic, as in when we are in an environment that is not nurturant to the spirit of who we are. From the pre-industrial aspect of point of view of ourselves, we could say that's when we're going to start experiencing soul loss. And the symptoms of that are going to be a lot of what we've just discussed, and described. So depressions and physical sicknesses and existential angsts and so on. So part of the time, this is where the conundrum really rises. Well, okay, so great. So what do we do about that? Because this is who we've become. This is how we live now. I mean, we can't exactly go and become hunter-gatherers wandering around in the wilderness anymore. No, definitely not. And yet we're tasked with reintegrating those lost parts of ourselves, that much bigger part of ourselves that has been lost, into who we've become, into this new context in which we find ourselves. And that's not entirely an answerable question at this point. All we can do is say, this is what we're called to. This is what we're called to address. How exactly we do that is much more of a conundrum. And it's probably at the heart of some of the work we're doing is we're saying, how do we bring, because when we talk about our ancient knowledge, whatever we want to call it, that our early historic, deeply embedded indigenous part of ourselves, how do we reaccess that? How do we reinvigorate it? How do we bring it back? Well, the first key to that is to try and recontextualize ourselves within an environment that speaks to that. Because it's not going to be able to come back within much of the kind of context that we find ourselves in now. But inevitably, it's going to have to be a blend of the two, and it's going to have to be a sort of a meeting, as Jung put it, it's kind of a conjunctio oppositorum, a meeting of opposites, and the attrition that results from this conflict between what the soul or spirit wants and what our evolved, industrialized personas want. There's going to be, there's a conflict between those two things on all levels. And yet, as Jung pointed out, that conflict is dynamic. It's in itself, the evolutionary force is kind of brought about and brought into being through that meeting of opposites. And so the best we can do at this point is give attention to those opposites equally, and to say, I'm not going to polarize one way or the other. I'm not going to try and become pre-industrial indigenous again. I'm not also going to try and become, super modern and super whatever industrialized. I'm going to try and allow the conflict between those two to be the place where I reside. And in that, I believe we will be led to, if you like, through the process itself, through the rising of the heat of that conflict, into another level of our evolution, which begins to reincorporate. We're starting to see that. I think, we're starting to see the reincorporation of these parts in ways that I would never have imagined possible. So in that sense, I think if we are at that midpoint, if we are willing to sit in that midpoint, our evolution and our reintegration is almost inevitable.
Colin, thank you. Yeah, I really connected with what you're saying there. I think that I see in the world, I feel, I know in the world, we're turning. So I can feel things turning, and I'm very positive about the future. I think we've got a hell of a job to claw back. We are at the precipice of the Anthropocene extinction, brought about by our fall, if you like. So in the language of Dr. Steve Taylor, the fall from anywhere between 11,000, 5,000 years ago to 11,000, we started to drop out of hunter-gathering principally, more moving towards city-state culture, the introduction of mass agriculture. Then came city-states, sky religions, getting us up is good, down is bad. Black is bad, white is good, man is good, woman is bad. So we sort of that birth of that, what I call taker culture, what he calls taker culture, from a lever culture before, has brought about this forgetting, this great forgetting of who and what we were for, as you said. I mean, 190,000 years of our current state of human being was spent hunter-gathering in wilderness, and so it's comparatively tiny amount of time that we have industrialized, and you know, at the absolute peak of the sickness, I think, was like around Industrial Revolution stuff, where, you know, in the West, the men disappeared off to work and they were gone. You know, the people growing up, dads were gone, and you know, the society really started to get quite ill. We had, before that, we had people, 7-year-olds being sent off to work to feed the industrial machine down mines and in factories and God knows what. And you look at that and you think, wow, that really was the peak of just having lost the plot completely. And with that there, we're sort of just swinging up. We're saying, you know, the treatment of children is not good. It's not great. It is better than it was. The treatment of different groups in society is not good. It's not great, but it's better than it was. So could you just speak a little bit to, if you like, the fall and the forgetting, and the recovery and the remembering, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, I remember actually a pivotal moment in 2003. I was in the UK at a conference there, and I was at a lecture by Thomas Berry, the theologian and cultural historian, and of course he was very well known, and a huge audience had gathered to hear him speak. And he stood up to speak, and his first words were, "The industrial age is over." You can imagine at that time, I mean, the shuffling and awkwardness that emerged in the room. And then he went on in his lecture to point out that, in his opinion, what we were now moving into was the age of the ecocene, which I think is a lovely description, in a way, of this potential for the reintegration of these two presently very distinct parts of ourselves, again, in fact, cleaved parts of ourselves. You know, I think that, I mean, we've got, who knows, you know, we've got a long way to go, and there's a lot happening that would easily kind of bring one to a state of despair right now. But I think in some ways it's a kind of a reaction to the specific changes that are going on. But I think, you know, where we're going, it feels to me like there's a thread. There's something that's going beneath the surface that perhaps it's archetypal, perhaps it's, I'm not sure, you know, but it's a directed, you know, Terence McKenna used this wonderful word, eschatological. So there's an eschatology, which means somewhere out, somewhere beyond, there's a coming together of everything in some form of unified whole. And that unified whole is almost calling creation to its culmination, if that makes sense, as an image. And I actually think that I've come more and more to believe that that's possibly true, that there's something pulling through this process that has, I wouldn't want to go as far as calling it an intelligence necessarily, but it's got a unified totality that is in some way incorporative of everything that's going on. Of course, whether that means we'll survive as a human species or not, given that 99.995% of species have gone extinct before, who knows? But in the end, I think, you know, there is a generative process happening, despite what we see in the kind of bisection of the moment that we find ourselves in now. And it is going, I think, towards some sort of an evolving of its own. I do think that right now we are in a position where the substrate of what being human means has fundamentally changed, and yet we haven't realized it yet. And so we're still floundering to be the humans we were, say, 50 or 100 or 200 years ago, in a context and in a form that is fundamentally different on many, many levels, but at the substrata level rather than at the kind of level of our everyday interactiveness. But our everyday interactiveness is being fundamentally disabled in many ways by that change. And the extent to which we start to expand into the possibilities of what is emergent at this point in time, I think we'll begin to realize those changes in ourselves. And that, in a sense, will take us into, well, hopefully, Thomas Berry's ecocene, this change that evolves us into who we're potentially becoming now. And of course, you know, there's a lot going on right now. We've spoken about the other than human world up to this point in terms of nature predominantly, and now we've got technological beings emerging. The whole AI scenario, which is fascinating. I mean, it's another form of existence that's coming into being that we're going to have to reconcile with. It's evolving, it's finding its place among us, and who knows what its place is going to be. And we're terrified by it, and we're excited by it, and we're hopefully making wise decisions about it. I'm not sure we are, but whatever the story, I think it's also an inevitability. It is an evolutionary upwelling, which is going to have significant impact on who we are and how we go into the future and the nature of the future that we find ourselves in. And it's going to be a very fundamental part of it. I think we have to accept that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colin, for your insight on that. I agree. I think, the always open to moving my perception, my thoughts on things. That's part of the sort of growth mindset, isn't it? Not having black and white, etc. But AI at the moment for me is, as I summarize, as giving us a break from left braining for a bit so we can start to find out how to human again.
Right.
That's my take on it at the moment is we don't need to be cramming children in education full of left brain stuff, facts, figures, the Battle of Hastings, what year was it, and nth degrees of algebra and stuff that my girls are doing at the moment. Yeah, because it's going to come along and do some heavy lifting. We need to be talking about emotional intelligence, of understanding ourselves, our connectivity, our interdependency, our place in the fabric of life. That's what, and letting kids play and explore and learn the way they do if you leave them alone and don't stuff them into pigeonholes. So that for me is, if we can use AI as to do the heavy lifting on that side of things, so that we can rediscover all of what we've been talking about, then it can save us. If we can help save us, if we go a different direction with it, an evil global megacorp gets a hold of it, and Terminator, the movie, Cyberdyne Systems comes about, but then it's probably a different path, right? But that's just a take on it. But just briefly, because I've got some other things I want to talk about. Do you have a take on AI in your knowing, in your feeling?
Oh gosh. Well, I'm fascinated by the whole thing and just watching, the conversations that are going on around it. And I absolutely love what you say, because, of course, one of the big fears out there at the moment is, we're just going to be robbed of everything we do as humans at the moment. And to be honest, everything we do as humans at the moment is sinking us anyway. So, is that quite the crisis we thought? Well, yes, it is, insofar as we don't know what else we would do. And we don't know how we would generate senses of meaning and all that kind of thing if we're not in the business of doing as we've always done. But I think that point, that axial moment, in a sense, where we literally cannot continue in the doing sense of what we've always been, is a very powerfully creative point, albeit terrifying once again, and racked with its own potential hazards. And yet, I think to renegotiate with ourselves and with each other the whole business and definition of what being human means is absolutely what's called for right now. The environmental and other crisis, the human crisis in general, the global crisis, is a symptom of not having addressed that issue and just blindly thundering forward in the sort of industrial way of things. And so stopping that, in a sense, and saying, well, now what? I think is the most valuable thing we can do. Albeit that I think, it's going to throw us into its own terror and crisis. And of course, the problem always is, we see this where, you mentioned the word colonialization earlier. And human beings have been colonials since time immemorial, ever since wherever we encounter another culture. There's the question of, okay, well, who's the dominant culture here? Who's got access to the resources? This has always been true. There's nothing new about that. But what tends to happen when a dominating culture comes in is there's a period, a twilight period. If I look here in Southern Africa, where you've got this sort of between world, between first worlds and the world that it encounters, and that's a dark time. It's a very dark time. It's a very destructive, degenerative time. The culture that was is being destroyed. The environment that went with it is being destroyed. And we move into this kind of, Armageddon-like twilight kind of environment. But it's a phase, because what it soon enough starts to happen once the dominant forces have settled in is that it starts to form itself, to shape itself again. And I think we're in a generative way, and I think we're seeing that in a sense with what's happening with artificial intelligence, in the sense that, I mean, yes, we are the instigators and the makers of it, but are we? Or is it making itself through us? Who knows? Either way, it's coming into being, and there's an encounter between who we've always been and who it is and what it becomes. And, if we're talking about intelligences millions of times that of our own, it's inevitably going to have a certain dominance that comes in. But we've got this twilight period when, of course, those who would, as being human, we would, are going to grab hold of, technology and its incredible capacities to basically further their own agendas. And that's going to be a very nasty business, really nasty. And you've got autonomous weapons and all that kind of stuff coming into being, and, gain of function technology used on bacteria and viruses and all these kind of things. It's dreadful. I mean, the prospect of that is heinous. And yet, at the same time, if we get beyond that curve and we get into what has been referred to as artificial superintelligence, if that's possible, for me, I mean, generally what I see is that and I think this is generally accepted, that there's a correlation between intelligence, essentially, and the recognition of the wholeness of a system, and the integrity and the integral necessity of all parts of that system being present and functional. In other words, that is going to generate the sense that whatever system we look at and whatever it is we do, whatever it is it does, if it's super intelligent, my assumption actually at this point is, rightly or wrongly, I think it's going to look at things in a win-win sense. And if major global decisions are made on a win-win, in a win-win framework for everything, systemically, I think there's a reasonable chance we're going to find ourselves in a very, very constructive and generative world.
Thank you so much, Colin. Really connect with that insight into AI. It's you're right to point out the scariness, the heinousness of some of the things that people are rightly frightened about. But I think I was encouraged that just keep zooming out. So it's a bit like when you're looking at human history, don't look at a few hundred years, look at a few thousand, keep going up. Right. And you see trajectories, you see growth from a sort of different place. So thank you for sharing that. I didn't want to derail the whole thing with AI because it's a topic in itself, but
it's very topical right now.
It's topical, yeah. So there's one thing I wanted to come back to. The words came up earlier, and I wanted to make sure we got some time with it. You mentioned shamanism, right at the start, and you said, well, that's come to mean a lot of things, a lot of things to a lot of people now. And I was introduced into it by the wonderful Paul Francis, who's written a number of fantastic books on therapeutic shamanism. So he came into it with a lens of being a psychotherapist, then a practicing animist, and his journey, and the blending of the two, that they're not opposites. They are sort of two sides of a similar coin, if you like. Psychotherapeutic work, particularly sort of inner child work or soul retrieval, is a sort of a modern lens by which we can understand some of these principles that have always been there. Wonderful. So I came in that way. But you say shamanism to people, they go, into your plant medicine, are you? It's like, straight away they're like, well, you're off doing, ayahuasca in the jungle. Or you're sort of trying to recreate a medicine man of the past from an indigenous culture, etc. I said, no. What do you? Could we sort of myth bust in your experience, animism and shamanism? Could you just sort of speak to those two and help us to understand?
I can try. They're very big subjects. Yes, well, So shamanism, as far as I understand, is a word that is derivative from a word in northern Siberia that was found by the mythologist and anthropologist Mircea Eliade. And he was studying very particular people in a sort of boreal region of the world with very particular practices and very particular ways of doing things. And this word, and I can't remember the exact word that shamanism came out of, the shaman, the practitioner of this, it was very specific, and had a very specific cosmology and a construct of the universe and so on and so forth. And he wrote about it in a number of his books. And it slowly kind of moved out from there and started to be used in all sorts of other contexts. And now there pretty much isn't a psychospiritual context in which the word shamanism isn't somehow part. So the problem with that, of course, is, it's a bit like when people say, oh, the traditions of Southern Africa are Sangoma. That's not true at all. Sangoma is a tiny little fragment of a massive traditions that exist here in Southern Africa, and a vast history of those traditions. And Sangoma is, by all intents and purposes, relatively new in Southern Africa compared to a lot of the much older traditions. So in saying that, traditional cultures practice Sangoma is a bit like saying traditional cultures all over the world, anybody practicing medicine in these ways is a shaman. It's kind of meaningless, and it's also a bit detrimental because it throws us into quite a lot of confusion. Because a so-called shaman in this place may be behaving entirely different, have a completely different cosmology to someone practicing shaman in another place, relatively close by even. So I think we got to treat that word quite carefully. I think I don't think it's possible to finally define it in terms of its usage in modern language, because it's just spread so thinly. Animism, on the other hand, is focused around a very simple premise, and that is that everything in the universe lives and has a spirit. So the spoon in your drawer lives and has a spirit. Everything, because it's part of creation, and creation is spirit. You can't differentiate what lives from what doesn't live. Even if we take the sort of Judeo-Christian model of saying God is everything, well, if God is everything and God lives, then surely everything lives. So that's really what animism is based around. And then when something becomes animate, as in it has a spirit and it lives, it becomes someone. And when something becomes someone, there's a capacity for a relationship between me and that, which is not possible if that is just some dead thing, and it's a little bit like, so Thomas Berry had this very beautiful statement which he made, which he said basically, in his opinion, the universe is a communion of subjects rather than a collection of objects. So a collection of objects is just the sort of haphazard bumping in of lifeless stuff which has no awareness, no consciousness, nothing. And a communion of subjects says that everything has awareness, everything is interactive, and everything is relational rather, and the entire universe is one huge mass of interrelatedness. That's animism.
You did a fantastic job there. I chucked you big topics, and you dealt with it beautifully. But for me, the animism is at the heart of it. So as I've developed my belief in living an animist life, it's brought, for me, it was like, I've done a lot of work. 26 years of psychotherapy, counselling, all that sort of stuff. Really, none of it cut through properly until I had a breakthrough, a breakdown, whatever you want to call it, a spiritual awakening, 5 years ago. But, some good work was done. I started to work on my body. So sort of mind started to take shape, if you like, mind, body, soul. I started to think really about what I'm eating. Am I moving enough? Doing the basic stuff a bit better. It started to come together. Big yawning chasm. The existential stuff, what does it mean? Why am I here? it was all still unanswered. But animism gave me a way through that said, well, if everything is alive and everything is conscious, the stone people, a stone, has a different consciousness to human, but it's no more, no less. It just is different. And through journeying, so shamanic journeying, to be stone, to be tree, be oak tree, and to put yourself in a meditative space where you can connect with that and experience what it might be like to shapeshift, and some of the other things that you do in journeying, or you can do in journeying. And that was it then. I felt like this pull that you were talking about towards something, I joined it. So I became of it. I felt like my life, I described to my coach one day, I said, my life's on, I can see the roller coaster tracks out in front of me now. I saw the end, I witnessed how I leave this life. And then I knew that I could operate with some level of certainty in where I am now, as far as the earth is going in the direction, my life is going in the direction. All things have consciousness, equal purpose, equal importance, and I am of this. I'm not kind of separate from. And in that moment, my life changed, and it stayed changed. So I think the principle of animism, I now look at everything differently. Like the relationship, they might say, I really love my. So for me, my surfboard. My surfboard is alive. I have a deep connection with it. It has great spirit, as do I. My surfing has changed because I am not in the water. I am of the water. Right. And we interact, we play together when I'm there, and I carry it with me wherever I go, etc. So it's sort of brought a fullness. Could you talk a little bit about, what you see, what it's brought in your life, and also you work with a lot of people, as we talked about in the bio. People come and train with you, they learn. What do you see people taking away? And when they write you nice letters and say, "Oh my God, Colin, it blew my mind," what are they saying to you?
They don't always write me nice letters. I think it really depends on each one of us as to how we meet this, the call of the time or the call of our own destiny or whatever it is. And sometimes it's absolutely horrendous, and in the midst of it, you're not going to write a nice letter saying, "Oh, wonderful, you showed me things that have made me," I feel a wreck. You've ruined my life. Anyway,
I feel worse than when I first saw you.
I think the thing about it is, I think what we're called to do right now is to move into a courageous experimentation with who being human means, and conditions are obviously pushing us into that thing. So when we're talking about animism, and you're saying, you have this relationship with your surfboard, I mean, most people in Western culture would look at you and say, I'm not sure that's that dodgy, and we're not going to like that idea necessarily. It's potentially even quite threatening, because indeed it is threatening to a lot of how we relate presently to the so-called material world, and how we treat it and so on. So as an experiment, one can say, all right, well, let's imagine for a second, let's suspend our disbelief for a time and say, what if everything was alive? How would that change the manner of my interactions? How would I relate to all that I encounter in my world that is necessarily other than human? What would my life look like if that were true? And so one can enter into a kind of an engaged experiment with this whole thing in terms of the stance that we take in our lives. And I think a lot of the work that I do really has to do with that, is suggesting changing, even sometimes just fractionally, a stance and saying, for a period of time, try this, even though it's very dissonant to the current kind of cultural story that we hold about creation and life and so on, whether on the spiritual or the material front. Either way, can we start experimenting with pushing those boundaries out a little bit and seeing what happens, literally? I think that's what I try to encourage. And then, as part of that, if people are interested, I say, and the things we can do, there's there's knowledge that we have that we can start bringing. As you discover things, there's ways of contextualizing it, there's ways of interacting with it, there's ways of representing it, and there are ways of re-scripting the core narrative by which I personally live or by which my culture lives. Essentially, we can really start looking at that very deeply, and I think, as again Thomas Berry and Brian Swim said in their book The Universe Story, a core narrative breaks down when it's no longer serving the generative whole anymore. And so it's at that point that we have to go back to the core narrative and say, okay, well, what do we believe about ourselves and our universe and creation? And why is there this dissonance? Why are things not working? And what could we start changing in that narrative? Because we behave according to that narrative, whether it's our own or our culture or our collective in general. That is the script by which we live. And so re-looking at that and re-identifying with it and looking at those areas where we could experiment with changing it and seeing essentially what emerges out of that. I think that's where a lot of the work lies at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I really connect with that. I agree. The thing I love most, actually, what you just said is just try for a minute to see, because that's actually very powerful, isn't it? Just to say, okay, just for half an hour, take the approach that everything's alive and has great spirit, and you have no one above you, you have no one beneath you. All peoples, stone peoples, animal peoples, plant, humans, whatever, are on parity. Just give it a go. Just have a laugh with it for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever you can manage, and see what happens, because we are what we do. So if you do that, you become that, and we become that, and it has changed, because you can't go around brutalizing yourself, each other, and the planet if it is alive. But if it's just a resource to be taken, to feed our sort of ever-growing brain, left brain, and dominance and money and then you can do whatever you want, with impunity. You can operate with impunity. So thank you. I know time has left for us today, and I'm mindful that we've got a little bit over. So I'm fascinated. Your work is wonderful that you're doing, and really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your life, about your work, and I hope we can have another conversation sometime.
Yeah, thank you. I've really appreciated this conversation as well. It's always an absolute pleasure for me to be talking of these sorts of things openly, and allowing the spirit of interactive discussion to kind of conjure up images and possibilities and in its own free way. So I really appreciated it. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Colin. And today's episode has been with Colin Campbell. You can find out a bit more about Colin and his work by looking at the links in the show notes today on YouTube, Spotify, etc. But it's been an episode of the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm Chris Braitch, with Colin Campbell, and we really look forward to seeing you on the next one, and are deeply grateful that you took the time to be with us today. So thank you very much, Colin. We'll say goodbye.
Thank you so much.
That's it. Take care.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening and watching. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.